Donald Trump called him tough. Rush Limbaugh read one of his articles live on his radio show. Ann Coulter tweeted that article to her 1.5 million followers and declared, "Every sentence is perfect." Ladies and gentlemen, your host, former chief editor of the Jewish Press, Elliot Resnick.
Welcome to the Elliot Resnick Show, enemy of the mediocre, the milquetoast, and the mendacious, champion of the excellent, the honest, and the uncompromising. If you've been following the news recently, you may have heard that a conflict is raging in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine. Now, if you've already decided that elite opinion is correct and that Putin is a modern-day Hitler, I would advise you to stop listening now. This show is not for you. It's not for people who follow the herd. It's for unconventional thinkers. If you're open, however, to the alternative view, if you think Western media outlets are lying to you about this conflict, then you may be interested in this episode of the Elliot Resnick Show, for which we've invited Dr. Gilbert Doctorow as a guest. Dr. Doctorow is a graduate of Harvard University, holds a PhD in Russian history from Columbia University, and is a fluent Russian speaker. He is also the author of 5 books and has appeared numerous times on TV and other media forums. Perhaps most importantly, he attempts to get at the truth of this conflict. He does not slavishly repeat the party line. And I would recommend that everyone regularly visit his website, gilbertdoctorow.com, for his commentary on this subject. The first thing I want to get to, Dr. Doctorow, is Putin's health and the level of support he enjoys in Russia. According to Western media outlets, Putin is in ill health and does not enjoy the support of the Russian people. You were just in Russia. What's your assessment?
I spent 6 weeks in St. Petersburg, and part of that time in the countryside, 80 kilometers south of St. Petersburg, where people are much more open and talkative than they are in any big city. What I can say is that the official polls, and I tend to believe them because they're quite reputable polls, show that 80% of the Russian population supports Putin and supports the war in Ukraine. That still leaves 20% who don't. And the 20% is people who are indifferent, but it also includes a lot of people who are quite vocal, and I would say a disproportionate number of very well-educated people. People who are well-educated tend to be difficult folks in every country, and do not necessarily toe the party line. And that's true in Russia as anywhere else. So you have a number of people in elites who are not sympathetic to what's going on, or not necessarily sympathetic to Mr. Putin. Still, 80% is 80%. In a democracy, that is a fantastic showing. Now, I just would like to say, because Ukraine is a special case, Russia has handled the war with Ukraine in a way that very few people in the West have paid attention to or cared to understand. They understood they should be liberators. They understood that this territory could conceivably become part of Russia, and they were supposedly defending Russian speakers. The last thing they wanted to do was to wage a war of shock and awe, United States style, going into Iraq, attacking and destroying all enemy forces and much of the civilian population in the path. No, the Russians wanted to do as little damage to civilians as possible, and they waged the war accordingly. The families in Russia, so many people have relatives in Ukraine or came from Ukraine. People at the top of the Russian government, like the speaker in the upper house of parliament, Matvienko. We know her as a former mayor of St. Petersburg. She comes from Ukraine. So a great many people have family relations, and families are split on this. For this reason, most people, say in the city, whom I've encountered, did not talk about it. Did not talk about it, but they don't know who you are, and they don't want to look for acrimonious disputes if they can avoid them. But they split in the population, the division, as I said, 80-20, that is real.
What do you make of the reports that Putin is ill?
Well, about 2 weeks ago, he spoke to the public for 1 hour, after which was a 2-hour Q&A at the plenary session of the annual St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which had hundreds of people. from many countries across the world. He spoke with great strength and with no visible impairment of any kind. And he had this Q&A of 2 hours. Again, he has no notes. It's all extemporaneous, and he seemed in good health. And that's not the whole story. After this, in the early evening, he went to a reception at which the master of ceremonies, who was the director of RT, he came to that, and she saw him there, and he was there meeting everybody and talking to everybody, and he seemed to be in great spirits. And that wasn't the end. Then he went on to other meetings. Now, this man is phenomenal. His mental focus, his strength, his sense of humor and playfulness with the Russian language, it was all in evidence. I don't know what possible illness he could be concealing, but you don't have that kind of fountain of strength that was exhibited just 2 weeks ago if you were gravely ill.
When Russia invaded Ukraine, Putin said that one of his objectives was to denazify the country. Many people raised their eyebrows when they heard that, since Ukraine's president is Jewish, and they concluded that Putin is obviously delusional and we shouldn't believe a word that comes out of his mouth.
Well, it's not just laymen who question this. The most outstanding case was the German Chancellor Scholz, who has a joint press conference with Putin in February, asked Putin about this allegations that the Kiev government was dominated by Nazis. Scholz said this was ridiculous. The Russian argument is a bit odd sounding to Western ears, and so a word of explanation is needed. We usually think about the Nazi regime as being behind the Holocaust and destruction of the Jewish nation in Europe. However, the Nazis' ambitions went well beyond the Jewish people. In Nazi ideology, they were the master race, and the Slavs, whether Poles or Ukrainians or Russians, were Untermenschen, lesser beings who were disposable and could be cleared away to create Lebensraum, living space for the great German nation. It was for that reason that the Germans had no qualms whatever about starving out Leningrad during the Great Siege and killing more than 1 million people. 1 million people died in that siege. That was one of the major achievements of the German Wehrmacht in World War II. So the point being that these racial views of the Nazis were not only limited to the Jewish people. And the argument made from Russia is that the Ukrainian, called the entourage, who are calling the shots for Zelensky, they are racists. In this case, the race involved is the Russian race, the Russian Slavic race, whom they want to destroy. And in that light, they take the threat of an armed Ukraine, backed by NATO, as being an existential threat to their country.
In addition to the threat that Ukraine poses to Russia, you've claimed that it also poses a grave threat to the Donbas region of Ukraine, where many ethnic Russians live. These are the people who set up the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. They rebelled following the anti-Russian takeover of Ukraine's government in 2014, which the West calls a revolution and Russia calls a coup d'etat. You've said that Ukraine, which killed thousands of civilians in the Donbas region since 2014, was scheduled to crush this rebellion in March, and Russia invaded Ukraine to prevent the Ukrainians from achieving this goal. If Russia succeeds in eliminating the Ukrainian forces in the Donbas region, does that mean it has achieved victory?
It sounds easy, but it's not easy. I said they had 8 years to fortify this area. And to fortify it, not in the open field, but in between residential buildings and civic infrastructure. And that is why there has been these accusations they bombed a theater, Russians have bombed a hospital, and so forth. Yes, they did. But these were no longer functioning hospitals or theaters. They were being used as camouflage by Ukrainian forces, from which they fired artillery in the hope of eliciting counterfire, which would then destroy the given building and would prove that the Russians were attacking civilian targets. It was all very calculating, all based on urban warfare, particularly where the expected Russian technical advantages would not be present, and where knowledge of the ground would be an important factor favoring the Ukrainians. The question of the intentions of Ukraine are not a matter of speculation. They are easily demonstrated by the disposition of forces on the ground. The greatest part of the Ukrainian military was not defending Kiev, even as the United States gave warnings for weeks that the Russians were going to attack. The Ukrainians did not move any of their troops to defend Kiev. They were intent on following through on their long existing plan to attack the Donbass and to sweep away the rebel governments. The fact that there is propaganda in play is something that any of your listeners can discover on their own by just watching closely what they see on their television screens and see if the images match the narrative. Our producers, the BBC producers, well, everyone thinks the BBC is a paragon of objectivity, but the BBC producers also take their audience to be nitwits. I'll give you an example. This was about 6 weeks ago when the Russians were moving on Kharkiv, and they sent in missiles. And the BBC reporter, so a very well-dressed lady with excellent coiffure, she was standing in the foreground. About 150 yards behind her is a partly blackened out 6-story building. And she's pointing back and saying, you see what the Russians have just done. They attacked this apartment house with their artillery. And can you imagine? 4 people died. 4 people died in a 6-story, rather large apartment building. That follows the narrative of the Russian side, that there was nobody in that building except a few Ukrainian soldiers and weapons. The same thing is true of this latest disaster in the center of Ukraine, around the shopping mall. Mr. Zelensky has gone crying to the world press and to world leaders. Maybe thousands of people have died there. It was a major shopping center. There were only 18 confirmed deaths. So the notion that was, we also know that building ceased to be an active shopping center in the middle of March. So it was an empty building, probably used to store fuel or weapons. And that was not the subject of the attack. The attack was adjacent, 90 meters away, hangars of a factory that otherwise repaired broken down tanks. In those hangars were the latest delivered US and UK high technology weaponry. That was blown to bits because there were munitions there. There were secondary explosions, which touched off fires that destroyed the shopping center. But as I said, you don't have to get the whole story. If you just looked at the figures that came out and were published in mainstream, that 18 people died in a place where Zelensky said there were several thousand taking refuge, you understand where's the truth and where's the propaganda.
I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the relationship between Ukraine's government and the ethnic Russians in the Donbass region.
The Baltics were a precedent. What happens when a government takes over that is in a position and the power to persecute the Russian-speaking minority that is part of their country? The most egregious case is in Latvia, which after 1991 canceled the citizenship of all Russians in their state who had arrived after 1939. These were 400,000 people many of whom had spent their whole lives in Latvia. Many of them were families of Russian military, because Latvia was an important military base. But that's not the point. The point is they became instantly stateless, no passports. They became subject to very severe restrictions on what jobs they can hold, that they cannot be bankers, that they cannot engage in various socially responsible positions, a cap on what they could do with their careers, and their limited ability to enjoy property rights. And their crushing of their language, the closing of Russian schools Russian language schools in Latvia. Continues to this day, and I have written about this, calling Latvia an apartheid state. The Russians in 1991 were in no position to protect Russian speakers in Latvia, the Baltics, or anywhere else. The situation in Ukraine is different in magnitude. It's not 400,000, but maybe 5 or 10 million people who would be subject to ethnic cleansing. And in time, the Russians have the military wherewithal to act on their interests today, which they didn't have in 1991 and didn't have in 2014.
What's Russia's endgame?
The Russian endgame has changed from day one to today, and it is still changing. It is dependent on the state of the correlation of forces on the ground and what is achievable and what are the consequences of stopping at any given point. I think the first mission, but let me just make the overriding issue is, does Russia gain territory by what it's doing? I think there have been many mistakes in Western analysis, Western commentary on the Russian mission in Ukraine. The first assumption is that they plan to go in and conquer the whole of Ukraine. With an army of 150,000 against a country of 40 million, coming in as an attacking army against defenders who are the same in number or greater, is not in line with all military doctrine. You never do that. You should have a 3, 4, 5, 10 time numerical advantage in your army if you're coming in to conquer a country. So where are we today, and what will be left when the game is over? I don't believe that the Russians will annex any of the territory that they have conquered now. I believe that the end game for them will be to release these republics as independent countries, which they will recognize, and an increasing number of countries across the world will recognize as sovereign states. They'll call it Novorossiya, New Russia, which is a name, one of several names that these territories enjoyed over the last 100 years. Why won't the Russians annex this? One thing is, I don't think they're very happy with the sanctions regime. And if they can exchange their hold on these territories for the recognition by Europe and by Ukraine of their independence, backed up by Russian security guarantees, they will gladly do that in exchange for lifting of the sanctions. The Russians do not want to create unnecessary problems for themselves. And so for them, I think that the end game will be to release these liberated republics as independent states, not to increase the territory of the Russian Federation.
And then these states would be a buffer between Russia and the West?
Exactly. I say just as Francois Mitterrand liked Germany so much, he wanted to see two Germanys. So the Kremlin likes Ukraine so much, we would like to see three Ukraines.
I see. Okay.
Novorossiya, something with a different name, perhaps covering the Black Sea coast through to Odessa, which they probably will conquer next, and a rump Ukraine, which is landlocked, essentially agrarian, and is 300-500 kilometers away from the Russian border. That rump Ukraine would necessarily be a neutral Ukraine and would have no access to NATO. It might be admitted to the EU. I don't think the Russians have trouble with that, because somebody will have to foot the bill of paying for this miserably impoverished rump Ukraine.
Some see this battle as partially cultural in nature. Putin is very traditional. He famously opposes homosexual marriage, for example, while Western elites and the Western media, of course, are progressive. Do you see a cultural component to this battle?
To this battle in Ukraine, no. The battle in Ukraine is between two traditional societies. Aside from the Nazi overlay and the very strange demonology that the entourage of Zelensky has adopted, as you see in the tattoos on their bodies, these strange Nazi types are not typical of the Ukrainian nation. Maybe 1 or 2% of the population is in that category of strange believers in the devil. The 98% are Orthodox Christians. They are very conservative in family values. They're against LGBTQ and the rest of it, just like the Russians are. That is not an issue of dispute between these two countries at war. The dispute is broader. It's with Western Europe, with the EU, NATO. Going back to 2014, we had a military dimension to a growing Cold War. Some people declared the Cold War just 6 months ago. Some people like myself declared the Cold War 10 years ago. But these were largely military competition and geopolitical competition. It didn't have an intellectual, ideological side. The traditional values versus progressive values has provided the partly formed Cold War with a full-blown Cold War, that is to say, with a very big ideological footprint. And it cannot be denied. The Russians are very conscious of this. You don't see it so much in the States as you see it in Europe, because however progressive the United States is on issues like same-sex marriages and the rest, the European side is very militantly secular, more so than the States. And this has been a big issue in the anti-Muslim movements in France and elsewhere. And it's a big issue in the anti-Russian or Russia-phobic feelings in Europe. The Russians had 70 years of communism. And when it was over, they rediscovered their religious roots. And there was a renaissance of the Russian Orthodox Church, which had been kept under close surveillance and used for police purposes by the communist state. It rid itself of the stooges and other state-controlled aspects. It became a genuinely ground-up movement. And that is something which is not welcomed in Europe, led by France, Now we're in 2022, but 1789 still has a lot of power in Europe. The French Revolution and the move against the church. Here in Europe, almost nobody is a churchgoer. The Catholic Church was dominant. A part of the glue of the Belgian state is just a shadow of its former strength. And there's tremendous resentment against Russia for its religiosity, the same way as there's tremendous resentment here against Muslims because they're believers. And Europeans are no longer believers. It's a sad state of affairs, but that is the situation. Just as the way that the G7 leaders are so resentful, and I feel such hatred towards Putin. It's a factor, it's a consequence of his intellectual superiority over the whole lot of them. We are led in Western Europe by pygmies, and they resent a strong Russia and a strong Putin.
When asked in the past about opposition to him, Putin replied that much of it is not organic, it's not Russian. Rather, it's people who are funded by foreigners. Is that true? And if yes, I wonder if you could talk about a little bit about that, because I don't think the average American has any conception of the role that foreign, ostensibly private money plays in the politics of some traditional countries.
I don't believe that statement by Putin is correct. I can understand why he would make it for political reasons, but it doesn't accurately reflect what's going on. As I mentioned earlier, a substantial part of the intellectual, or they call themselves the creative community, people who are in the arts, people who are in, say, marketing, they are anti-Putin. They have been from day one. Your grandmother was pro-Putin. The so-called simple people were always pro-Putin. Now, let me say a word about the pro-Putin and simple people. We've just come out of COVID. And I can tell you that in the countryside, the simple people all got vaccinated, all of them. In the city, intellectual friends we had, oh, no, this is not needed. It's all a scam. They were just too damn smart. So sometimes you have to trust. Sometimes you have to be a Democrat and trust the people.
Interesting. In America, it was the exact opposite. The simple people didn't trust the vaccine, and the educated class ran towards it.
Well, that's why it's interesting to travel. There are many variations in these combinations across the world.
But partially, I asked this question because it's hard to understand sometimes why the West is so militantly pro-Ukraine. And some people argue that it's not really about Ukraine per se. It's about many different NGOs and billionaires like George Soros who have various ideological and business interests, that it's not really about Ukraine, it's not about Putin, it's not about Russia or anything like that.
I wouldn't say it's not about Putin, it's not about Russia. It is. Let's go back to 2014, when Victoria Nuland said publicly to the press that the United States had invested $5 billion to influence Ukraine politically. This was not Mr. Soros. This was the U.S. government, U.S. taxpayers' money. A great deal of money has been expended by the United States government to back Navalny. Before that, to back Nemtsov. All of the heroes of the neoliberal movements enjoyed United States financial backing. There's no question about that. However, to say that the liberal with a big L, anti-Putin movements or followers in Russia have all been paid by the United States would be vastly mistaken. Just as to think that the United States has created a neocon movement in Europe. I mean, Europeans also have their own brains, and they developed in parallel to the United States their own neocon movement. the intellectuals who I mentioned before, these are privileged elites. And of course, for them, the Ukraine war and the severe sanctions, the cut of all travel with the West is very painful. People are selfish. They're selfish everywhere, not just in any one country. And selfish people don't like when their interests are, or their way of life is disrupted. And this war and the US sanctions have disrupted the way of life of many people in Russia. So that also explains those who are not in the Putin camp. But the Soros factor in Russia is today non-existent. The U.S. funding, U.S. government funding through various NGOs, yes, that has been present. Like I was working in Russia from 1994 to the year 2000, and living there full time. And I had various positions, various jobs, and one of them was as the director of the field office, the Moscow office of the international academic exchange with Russia, which after the breakup of the Soviet Union took on additional functions to assist U.S. Charitable projects and build a civil society in Russia. And I can tell you that our office was a nest of CIA, and I quit. They were using it to send intelligence officers out to the Caucasus to create trouble. So the U.S. activities and government-sponsored activities have been going on ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union. This isn't a new development, and there is substantial money behind it.
I've always found Putin to be a very interesting person. I actually knew very little about him until 2016, when the left viciously attacked him, and since I'm right-wing, I was immediately inclined to like him. Then Oliver Stone's Putin interviews came out. Now, normally I would have nothing in common with Oliver Stone, who's a radical leftist, and yet in this film, he essentially lets Putin talk for himself, and almost everything Putin said in this documentary rang true to me.
No, Putin is an extraordinary figure, but he wasn't always an extraordinary figure. When you go back to the start of his career as president, he did not speak well. He was very self-conscious, and he didn't interact with the public and with the press very well. He's had 20 years to learn, and he's learned very well. He is a giant on the world stage. It's all the more so because he's up against pygmies. If there were people of real stature in the West, then they would be one-on-one. But it's to our great misfortune that there aren't such people of stature. And the one thing to remember about him is that he does what he says. And he says what he does. And there's a complete match there. Regrettably, that is very rare in our time and day.
You were telling me before that in addition to your own website, Johnson's Russia list is a good place to get balanced information on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Is that correct?
Johnson's Russia list. Just go to Google, look up Johnson's Russia list. It'll show, Wikipedia will tell you at once what the website is. And John Mearsheimer, Mearsheimer, Mearsheimer. Look him up again in Google. It'll take you to his Foreign Affairs article of 2014. More importantly, because there's no restriction on access, to his YouTube lectures from 2014 and from 2022. They are as good as it gets.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you. So, that does it for us. Stay tuned for next week's episode of the Elliot Resnick Show, for which we will be interviewing John Rosemond, who is an old-fashioned parenting expert. If you think modern parenting is nuts, Oh, dear Maishala. Oh, you hit Mommy? Oh, why did you hit her? Would you like to say I'm sorry? Oh, you don't want to say I'm sorry? Okay. Would you like to go to bed? You don't want to go to bed? Oh, all right. Oh, I wonder why he's misbehaving like this. Maybe something happened a few weeks ago. We have to uncover deep in his unconscious what happened. We have to pay a psychologist several $1,000s to discover the deep cause. Maybe he's frustrated. Maybe he doesn't have the words to express why he's frustrated. If you think all of this is absolutely nuts, you will want to listen to next week's episode of The Elliot Resnick Show. Stay tuned.